let's get started again. So our second speaker is Agata Bielik Robson, who is professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Nottingham. She's published widely on all areas of Jewish thought, with special emphasis paid on modern Jewish thought from Spinoza to Derrida. She's the author of Another Finitude, Messianic Vitalism in Philosophy, Jewish Cryptotheologies of Late Modernity, Philosophical Moranos, and co-editor of Judaism and Contemporary Thought, Traces and Influence, and also Tzimtzum and Modernity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this invitation. I had to study Buber's attitudes toward China quite separately in order to get prepared for this session. And this is a kind of a result of this research. So, ex Oriente looks Martin Buber's Dao-Hasidic mysticism of the worldly. Martin Buber's interest in Chinese Daoism begins very early in his intellectual career and coincides, not at all accidentally, with his interest in Hasidism. Both are treated by him as the cases of spiritually rich Orientalism, which he opposes to the disenchanted West, as he claims essentially incapable of any mystical transport. Between 1906 and 1909, he writes the Tales of Rabbi Nachman, the legend of the Baal Shem, and Baal Shem Tov, and the Hasidism-inspired Ecstatic Confessions. But he also, under the influence of Wang Qingdao, the visiting lecturer at the Berlin Seminar for Oriental Languages, publishes Talks and Parables of Zhuangzi. Am I pronouncing it right? Zhuangzi. Talks and Parables of Zhuangzi, 1910, and Chinese Ghosts and Love Stories, which offer a partial translation of Liaozhai Zhiyu, an early 18th century compilation of folktales done by Pu Songling. From this time on, Daoism, interpreted in close comparative relation to Hasidism, will never leave Buber, although he will modify his attitude so as its main concept, the Dao, over time. While in Buber's early phase, Dao is most of all a notion of a mystical unity, connecting the sage with the essential oneness of the world. In the later, the so-called dialogic phase, beginning with his 1923 I and Dao, Dao emerges rather as the path, the dynamic way into and through the world, appreciated in its concreteness and multiplicity. Thus, in his Ascona lecture on Daoism, delivered in 1924, Buber repudiates his earlier, as he calls it, escapist mysticism of the one, which now transforms into an intra-worldly mysticism of the two, strongly focused on the ultimate realness of the particulars, never again to be considered as an ontological illusion. Just as before, Dao represented for him a transcendental oneness underlying all, closely corresponding with the Hasidic understanding of God as the Echad, that is the one pervading all creation. Now, in the later phase, it represents for him a path into the world where creation is to be conceived as individuation of all things, this time corresponding with the other meaning of Echad, not simply one, but strictly singular and unique. Thus, although Buber will never write a separate piece devoted to the Chinese thought, most of his commentators assume that Daoism stayed with him forever, as firmly as Hasidism, even if his changing interpretations of both took quite a winding path. But after all, as he wrote in his essay on Lao Tse, Dao means the path. According to the classical definition of Edward Said, Orientalism is a specifically Western phenomenon, in which the East is constructed as the eternal other of the West, with the strong emphasis on Eastern exoticism, an ambivalent mixture of fascination and repulsion. This eternal difference has a gender undertone. While the Occident understands itself as a male principle of action and domination, the Orient is construed as its female opposite, passive, and fatalistic principle of non-action of what the Chinese tradition calls Buber. Always very important for Buber, and Daniel already mentioned it. On Said's critical account, such gendering of the East-West difference is far from accidental. The fatalistic passivity of the Orient serves as the justification of the Occidental global hegemony, which not only is not resisted, but even perhaps welcomed, thus legitimizing the Western attempts at the colonization of the East, that according to Said includes not only Middle East and Asia, but also parts of Africa. Although Germany, the belated nation, was indeed late in the realization of her colonial ambitions, lagging in this respect behind England and France, she also had her imperial moment. The Kiachu Bay was a German leased territory on the southern coast of the Shandong Peninsula in Imperial and Early Republican China from 1898 to 1914, covering an area of 552 square kilometers. It had its administrative center at Qingdao. This short period of 16 years was enough to raise a German interest in the Chinese culture, and the Oriental Institute in Berlin, where Buber was a frequent guest, hosted many visitors from China, also interested in German culture. Wang Qingdao was one of them, and he became Buber's close acquaintance. Although Buber's interest in the Chinese tradition coinciding with Germany's imperial moment may indeed fall under the banner of the Orientalist fascination with the great other coming from the East, it is only so on the first glance. First and most of all, to him the Chinese wisdom is not at all that other. Thinking about himself as an Eastern Jew, as opposed to the deeply westernized Jews of the German Haskalah, that is Enlightenment, Buber feels more affinity to the parables told by Zhuangzi than to the neo-Kantian tractates written by Hermann Cohen. Born in Vienna, but raised in Ukraine, in the rich family of Jewish landowners, a very rare class possible only in the 19th century Polish Galicia, Buber was surrounded by the Hasidic folklore, deeply pre-modern, magical, steeped with Kabbalistic imagery, with the teaching mostly based on folk tales and legends, thus giving the massive privilege to the Haggadic narrative over the halachic law. Already in his adolescence, Buber rebels against the masculine assimilationist atmosphere of his grandparents' wealthy mansion, and begins to identify with the Eastern Jew, their Ostjude, the Russian barbarian with an absurd fur hat on his head. This derogatory description is obviously not Buber's himself. It was actually uttered by Hermann Cohen, about a Hasid, him who once had a brief conversation on his way to the Berlin synagogue. Now you may say that for the well-educated Vienna-born young Buber, speaking already in 10 tongues, Danish included, because he wanted to read Kierkegaard in original, the Hasidic tzaddik would be as exotic as the fur-clad Ostjude was for Cohen, so that already his choice of Hasidism was Oriental enough, and the slightly later choice of Daoism even more so. But it would be too simplistic, for it is not exoticism of either the Hasidut or the Dao that attracts Buber. It is not a simple reversal of the repulsion of Cohen, who simply could not stand the Eastern Jewish exotic variant of the Eastern variant of Jewishness, and refused to have anything in common with it. I would say that the affinity he feels is genuine and not at all exotic. Spiritually, he feels at home with both Baal Shem and Zhuangzi, precisely because he cannot feel at home in the Western modern culture. Having spent his youth on the borderline between East and West, between the vast continuum of the Russian Empire stretching from Ukraine to China on the one hand, and the last Galician outpost of Haskala, the Jewish Western Enlightenment, on the other, this prepared him well to take a borderline philosophical position which eventually became his trademark despite all the changes in the doctrine itself, looking critically at the Occident from the Oriental perspective. Indeed, as in the proverbial ex Oriente lux, using the light coming from the Eastern wisdom in order to see better what is wrong with the Occident. So, what would Baal Shem say about the instrumental reason? What would Lao Tse say about the violence done to the world as a part of the scientific conquering of nature? What would Zhuangzi say about the hypertrophy of Western philosophical systems? These are young Buber's questions. He puts on the hypothetical fur hat, turns into a Dao-Hasid or Hasidaoist, however you want to call this hybridical Oriental identity, and with it he tries to gain a critical perspective. His critique of the West is not internal. This is not the type of what Adorno termed an immanent critique, coming from the heart of the Western Enlightenment in order to save it. It is external and offering a full alternative to the Occidental modern model of life, out of the sources of his Oriental Judaism, where Hasidut and Dao emerge as the twin expressions of the same Eastern wisdom. As Lawrence Zilberstein recently put it, Buber's basic concern was not to construct a philosophical system, but to render visible the alienating forms of contemporary society and provide an alternative way of thinking and relating. The Orient was constructed by him as precisely a rich source of such alternative ways. The East does not be exotic to Buber, as it is usually the case with the Western Orientalists, but it is certainly homogeneous. The East and the West constitute for him the ultimate axis of the divide. The same, however, can be said of early Buber's unified take on the whole of the Occidental culture. So Jewish Jesus, Hindu Buddha, and Chinese Lao Tse fuse together and form a three-headed dragon of Eastern wisdom, delivering essentially the same teaching of the all-underlying unity which only a singular human life can embody. The mystery of the Echad, meaning simultaneously one, united with everything that exists, and unique, that is, an individual manner of striking this all-connection, which can only become embodied in a singular life. And it is also important to notice that for Buber, even in his youngest years, Jesus is most of all Jewish, and because of that an Oriental type of a sage, that is as far as possible from the Aryanized version of the Greek Christ adopted by both Catholic and Protestant Christianity. This, for Buber, constitutes the teaching as such, not of what, but rather the very medium through which the teacher speaks. Teaching is not an abstract knowledge which can become detached from its bearer. It is rather a demonstration of, in George Agamben's very apt terminology, an example, an exemplary life. The teaching cannot be absorbed by the pupil and simply followed, because here there is no clear rule to follow. Each singular life must learn the pathway itself, beginning afresh, but not completely ex nihilo. The teaching also forms a tradition, a tradendum, which is meant to facilitate the process, but only to a certain extent. So while the strength of the West, says Buber, consists in abstraction, the creation of knowledge, laws and rules to follow, The strength of the East consists in exemplarity, the creation of the body of teaching, which accumulates in stories, legends, and myths, and as such resists reduction to an abstract philosophical paradigm. It refuses to take the passage from mythos to logos. It stays with the mythopoetic account of singular lives and the winding, unfollowable individual paths towards the one. According to Buber, therefore, China has a foundational power in form of the teaching, Lehre, which stands on the oneness of the one that is necessary. It can be accessed by us, moderns, through the images of Lao Tzu's Dao de Jing, that is the teaching of Dao, or the parables, poetic parables of Zhuangzi. For Buber, Dao, I quote, is the universal foundation, Allgrund, and the universal sense, Allsinn, which does not exist in itself, but only through the negation of all apparent existence that makes it close to non-being, but also simultaneously constituting the being and destiny of all things. Tao is not an arche, which can be abstracted as the first principle from the manifold of its phenomenal manifestation. It is not so much the primordial existence from which all elements originated, but rather the oneness in the transformation, in the multiplicity of things, and in the multiplicity of the moments that follow upon one another. Tao is thus one with the world, with the changing world, but then to treat the world without the unifying force of Tao would be to fall into the trap of a merely apparent existence, that is, ontological illusion. Now, in what way Buber's understanding of the East-West divide deviates from the typically Western Orientalist projection of the mystical East? Let's compare his approach to the classical one of Hegel. Yes, another reference to Hegel. Unlike Hegel, the paradigmatic Western thinker who targeted the so-called Oriental metaphysics as the great other, actually the eternal enemy of Occidental philosophy, Buber defends the Orient and its focus on oneness against the divisive spirit of the West. Yet, just like Hegel, but only with a positive spin, he sees this divide as precisely the fundamental and bridgeable difference between the one and the many, between the Eastern praise of the all-encompassing unity of all things on the one hand, and the Western praise of differentiation on the other. In his lectures on the history of philosophy, Hegel lists the defining features of the Oriental metaphysics as follows. 1. The principle underlying all things is the one of absolute non-differentiation, when there is no opposites and all seemingly contrasting phenomena, like day and night, light and darkness, life and death, ultimately mingle into unity. 2. This unity is essentially static. If it moves, its dynamic resembles the aimless movement of the sea, with no beginning and no end, lashing back and forth, like an elemental force that has no purpose. 3. The Eastern wisdom consists in a non-dialectical deactivation of all dualisms, the goal of which is to adapt to this non-teleological sea-like movement of the element of one. Here, Hegel is not the only one in noticing this fundamental difference. William Blake, very much on the side of the Western dialectics, famously criticized the Oriental mysticism in a similar manner. In the primordial one, which he calls in his poetic idiom Beulach, all differences are asleep and do not rise to the fiery state of contraries. There is no fight between the opposites and hence no vision of a future dialectical reconciliation, which also means that there is simply no future. In the state of sleep, the past, the present, and the future mingle into one, a nunc-stans of timelessness. From this follows the fourth characteristic, the dream-like nature of existence as never fully actualized, or as Lao Tse has it, a profound reverie, which keeps to the perennial equilibrium of yin and yang. This has a practical implication, which, according to Hegel, is the fifth feature. Living in a dream calls for the principle of non-action as a gentle going with the flow. There is a certain fatalism, or passive amor fati, as in Buber's translation, ordained by the Creator, who clearly does not wish beings to awake to the state of separation and difference. In one of the Chinese tales rendered by Buber in 1910, called Prince of Clouds and Primordial Fog, the One as well as the Creator, also called here Divinity, is imagined as the primordial fog, which blurs all clear differentiations that dissolve into the misty element. In Hegel, Oriental metaphysics, this primordial fog appears under the name of Urnebel, or the originally indifference, that is the state of undifferentiation. So in this little parable, the prince meets the fog and asks him for advice in ruling the country. The foggy divinity is very displeased with the worldly order of things, which became remote from the source. Okay, yes. That the order of the world is topsy-turvy, said Fog, that the conditions of living are confused, that the will of heaven has no effect, that the field animals keep dispersing, that the birds shriek in the night. True, very true, said Prince of Clouds, but what can I do about it? That's exactly it, cried Primordial Fog, from which evil arises. Turn back. It doesn't happen often, objected the prince, that I encounter you, or divinity. That is why I'd be delighted to obtain some advice. Primordial Fog spoke. And this is the explication of turn back. Let your heart be your guide. Stay inert, and the world will do well by itself. Stop feeding your stomach. Spit out intelligence. Forget the world of things. Become one with the undifferentiated. Let go of your spirit. Free your soul. Empty yourself. Become nothing. Let all beings return to their roots. If they return to the roots without knowledge, a simple purity will emerge, which they will never lose, while knowledge will only cause destruction. If you do not look for the names of things and the relationships, all things will blossom forth of themselves. O divinity, said Prince of Clouds, before he had bowed down twice and taken his leave, you have bestowed power upon me and filled me with a secret. That which I long sought, I have now found. Turn back is the imperative to return to the simple unity of the root source, where things are no longer separate, but dissolve their contours and become nothing, one with the one. Now, for Hegel, this return to indifference and differentiation constitutes the indelible mark of what he calls acosmic ontological nihilism. The sixth, last but certainly not least feature, acosmic ontological nihilism, which prefers decreation over creation by preventing the opposites to actualize their differences and keeping them merely potential, or in the Blakean idiom, asleep. It is better to not be than to be. It is better to absorb death while being alive and treat death not as the end, but rather as the gate to the primordial fog, where the undifferentiated beings can enjoy the true royal happiness. And indeed, so claims the skull in the story called The Death's Head, in which Zhuangzi receives a lesson about dying. Would you care to hear about death? Please, said Zhuangzi. The skull went on. In death there is no overload and no underling. The happenings of the times are unknown. Our modest existence comes from the existence of heaven and earth. The happiness of the prince of the people is nothing compared to our happiness. But Zhuangzi did not believe him and said, if I could persuade the master of destiny to let your body be born again and give you back your flesh and bone so that you could return to your parents, to wife and child, to friends and intimates, wouldn't you be willing? Thereupon the skull opened its eyes wide, furrowed his brow, and said, why should I discard my royal happiness and sink into the toil of the human lot? All these 6 features of what Hegel calls Oriental acosmism, right, so turned against the world, re-emerge in Buber's reconstruction of both Daoism and Hasidism, but in affirmative manner. At this early stage of his thinking, Buber sticks very firmly to the Hegelian cliched summary of the unbridgeable gap due to which in the famous or rather infamous formulation of Kipling, the East is East and the West is West. But instead of using it as a demonstration of the West's superiority, he wholeheartedly says yes to the Eastern teaching of unity. Feeling a deep affinity with the Ukrainian Ostjuden, Buber sees his own Jewishness as Oriental, in this manner once again following the footsteps of Hegel, for whom the most dangerous, because too close to the Western core representative of Oriental metaphysics, was no other but Baruch Spinoza, the Jewish Oriental thinker of the undifferentiated pantheistic one, according to Hegel. Yet in Buber's account, there is one significant deviation from the Hegelian summary of the Oriental metaphysical wisdom. While Hegel strongly accuses the East of ontological nihilism and acosmism, Buber's take on unity and dedifferentiation is to the contrary quite pro-cosmic and world-affirming. His is the intra-worldly mysticism in which the imperative of turning back does not dissolve the phenomenal reality into nothingness, but only keeps it closer to the unifying source. This difference comes to the fore most visibly in his Legend of Baal Shem, which was published just 3 years later, 1907, and whose structure is very similar to the one of Chinese Tales. It is a collection of stories told by the generations of the Hasids about the 18th century founder of the movement, Baal Shem, prefaced by Buber with a strongly anti-philosophical and mystical manifesto. And it is hard not to notice that his praise of the Hasidic righteous one, the Tzaddik, finds a very clear echo in his slightly later praise of the Chinese perfected one. This affinity is deliberately exaggerated. Buber wants to present Hasidut as the joyful, benevolent teaching of all-embracing divine unity, and in this manner similar to the simple joys of Dao, which, when properly learned, can only bring, as Lao Tse claims, childish serenity. He thus glosses over the profound negativity of the Lurianic Kabbalah, which underlies the Hasidic Messianic doctrine, and which, as Gershom Scholem reminded Buber in his critical appraisal of the latter's take on Hasidism, constitutes one of the darkest, if not simply the darkest, moment of the so-called Jewish gnosis. The vision of the world plunged into the abyss of exile, imagined as the Aguna, the deserted bride, abandoned by God, who vacated the throne and became absent, withdrawn, inactive, unable to prevent the evil of false creation, the material prison of the spirit. There is no equivalent for this in Chinese states. Even if critical of the world, the masters of the Tao see the worldly imperfection as the effect of deviation from the principle, mostly because of bad governance, but not as the principle itself. There is no room here for the metaphysical corruption that would lie in the essence of being as such. If corruption occurs, it is due to the human lack of wisdom. And there is no dualism of spirit and matter, on which the Hasidic Gnosticism heavily relies, treating the latter as the oppressive shell, kelipod, keeping captive the spark, nitzotz, of the former. On the contrary, just as life and death mingle into the winding path of the deep unity, so does body and mind, never seen as separate, let alone inimical. Buber, however, intentionally downplays those stark dualisms because they do not fit his understanding of the Oriental wisdom teaching, which is Oriental wisdom teaching, which is not about the cosmic drama longing for its future messianic redemptive solution of tikkun olam, that is mending of the world, but about living in the world that needs no mending, because it is full of mystical joy here and now. He thus again quite deliberately misrecognizes the famous simcha or hitlahavut, that is the joyous rapture of the Hasids. While for him it is the joy of finding wondrous unity in the multiplicity of creation, for Scholem, his critic, and he is definitely closer to the historical truth, it is rather a joy of finding way out of creation, a joy of miraculous decreation in which the error of the world becomes corrected and undone. Yet, while downplaying the Gnostic doctrine of the cosmic drama, Buber can indeed stick to his Orientalist conviction that all mysticism is one, and that all mysticism comes from the East. For him, the Hasidic piety, referring to the Ein Sof, the Kabbalistic original infinite or without limit, comes exactly from the same source as the Chinese reverence for the primordial fog, which preserves things in their intended undifferentiation. Let's have a closer look at Gershom Scholle's critique of Buber, because it quite precisely reveals the latter's Orientalist projection of the Eastern unified source of all mysticism, in which Hasidut and Daoism mingle into one. Scholem, himself not participating in the belief that ex oriente lux, points to Buber's deliberate neutralization of the annihilating moment in the Hasidic teaching for the sake of a visionary affirmation of the living world made of the intense I and Tao encounters. So where Buber sees the messianic intensification of life in the world, Scholem sees the acosmic destruction and the mystical evacuation out of the world. Precisely as in this central Hasidic story, quoted both by Buber and by Scholem. Baal Shem once asked an outstanding scholar about his relation to prayer. What do you do and where do you direct your thoughts when you pray? He answered, I bind myself to everything and individual vitality which is present in all created things. For in each and every created thing there must be a vitality which it derives from the divine effluence. I unite with them when I direct my words to God in order for my prayer to penetrate the highest regions. That could also sound very much like Buber's version of Tao. But then Baal Shem said to him, if that is what you do, you destroy the world. For in extracting its vitality and raising it to a higher level, you leave the individual created things without their vitality. According to Scholem, Buber is the one who does not know that if he longs to extract the sparks of the great life from things, he also longs for the destruction of the world. The Gnostic negativity cannot be easily eliminated. It remains an integral part of the doctrine, which in its core was devised as radically anti-creationist and anti-cosmic, and thus even more strongly against the world than in Hegel's description of the Eastern a-cosmos. In Scholem's word, the Hasidic authors obviously did not believe that they had in any way broken with the Gnostic tradition of the Kabbalah, and little as Buber wants to admit it, they wrote clearly and plainly as Gnostic. The Hasids do not teach us to enjoy life as it is. Rather, they advise us, rather demand of us, to extract, I am tempted to say distill from life as it is the perpetual life of God. But this is the salient point. The extraction is an act of abstraction. For precisely in that act in which let the hidden life shine forth, we destroy the here and now instead of, as Buber would have it, realizing it in its full concreteness. In Scholem's reading, the Hasidic mysticism may be anti-cosmic, but its principle is very much Western. It belongs to what Jakob Taubers defined as Occidental eschatology. Its Western feature is the extreme dramatization of the struggle of contraries, spirit and matter, the goal of which is the messianic final extraction, abstraction, separation, which allows the former to disentangle itself from the fake unity with material concreteness. In Buber's deliberate orientalizing misreading, it is precisely this unity in which spirit and matter become concretely intertwined in a singular path on each and every life, which needs to be discovered and preserved. This is the Dao moment, which gives a palpable Chinese touch to Buber's version of Hasidism, coming as close to the Taoist monism as possible. But the monistic fascination soon leaves Buber. The radical break in his thought occurs around 1918, not at all accidentally after the experience of the First World War, which, as Buber will claim, in fact, very similar to Rosenzweig, as already Daniel showed us, taught him the opposite lesson of the irreducible absolute reality of a singular finite life, realizing itself here and now, very much differentiated, separate, and threatened by death. In the 1929 text called The Dialogue, Buber refers to this break as his conversion, which he then interpret as his new tshuva, meaning in Hebrew, the return. This time, however, not as the turning back towards the all-unifying source, but as the turning back towards the worldly and the everyday life. Here comes the quote: "Since then, I have given up the religious, which is nothing but the exception, extraction, exaltation, ecstasy, or it has given me up. I possess nothing but the everyday out of which I am never taken. The mystery is no longer disclosed. It has escaped, or it has made its dwelling here, where everything happens as it happens. I know no fullness, but each mortal hour's fullness of claim and responsibility. If that is religion, then it is just everything, simply all that is lived in its possibility of dialogue." Yet it does not mean that in his new conversion, tshuva towards the worldly manifold of things, Buber no longer makes any recourse to either Hasidut or Dao. No, Buber once again reshuffles his concept of the Oriental wisdom by stressing even more, in an implicit polemic with Hegel, its pro-cosmic, pro-worldly character. Right after the above description of his tshuva, he quotes the Hasidic tale called Above and Below. Above and below are bound to one another. The word of him who wishes to speak with men without speaking with God is not fulfilled. But the word of him who wishes to speak with God without speaking with men goes astray. There is a tale that a man inspired by God once went out from the creaturely realms into the vast waste. There he wandered till he came to the gates of the mystery. He knocked. From within came the cry, "What do you want here?" he said. "I have proclaimed your praise in the ears of mortals, but they were deaf to me. So I come to you, that you yourself may hear me and reply." "Turn back," came the cry from within. "Here is no ear for you. I have sunk my hearing in the deafness of mortals." True address from God directs man into the place of lived speech, where the voices of the creatures grope past one another, and in the very missing of one another succeed in reaching the eternal partner. So, no more holy rapture, ecstasy of oneness, joy of reverting straight to the source. Now it is the source itself that commands to turn back, not to the one, as in the story about the primordial fog, but to the chaotic reality of creatures which, actualized as separate, can only relate to one another in the dialogic attempt to reach one another. The pre-established harmony of mystical oneness gives us way to the idea of the dialogue as relation, which must be made precisely because there is no one. All is irreversibly divided, differentiated, noisy, and disordered. And so it should be. A parallel change occurs in Buber's reading of Liaozhai. In his 1924 Ascona lecture on Daoism, he once again praises its Oriental wisdom, but this time he is less prone to the totalizing view of both the East and the West. He says, "We must find the corresponding equivalent to what we regard as good in the East. Now fully convinced that the Western tradition is not so uniform and can also chime with a call that comes to Europe from the East to find a common cause with Asia." And then he concludes, "With Liaozhai, one remains in reality. There is no talk of stripping individuation. World and individuation coincide with each other." Here Buber no longer mentions a union with Tao or returning to the primordial undifferentiated fog which occupied him in the early phase. Led by his new understanding of turning back, he redefines the notion of the mystical return. The returning is not a sinking into, but an entrance into unity where the manifold becomes all the more real. He is thus also ready to redefine the boundary between the East and the West, which no longer appears so absolute. Having rejected all the remnants of what Hegel targeted as Oriental acosmism, he can now continue his Hasido-Daoism as an alternative way, which does not come completely from the outside, but enjoys a dialogic relation with the tradition. Thank you.
So we're like way over time anyhow, so I'm just going to relax and just say 5 minutes or so for questions before we move on. Yes.
Thanks so much for that. I think that was a third, in a sense. I was wondering, to which degree, I mean, from my scope, I know Buber through the I-thou, the essential we sort of dyad or discourse. And I was just thinking, as you were talking, to which degree does the sort of how do you say, the dualistic nature of West and East, and his sort of stance from within Daoism outward kind of fit into that essentialist we part, if that's at all.
Essentialist, sorry, what?
Essential we, sorry. The idea of both ands comes to mind, this idea that everything can exist in antipodes but is on a continuum. So to which degree, from this Oriental view, from this Eastern view outwards, does it actually relate to the West?
Well,
rephrase it maybe.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, in a way, Buber is full of those Orientalist cliches, but he actually deeply believes in them, especially at the beginning, and he wants to use them in order to criticize the West. So obviously, I Am Thou is exactly a kind of a philosophical attempt to secularize a kind of a religious mystical wisdom that he extracted from both Zhuangzi and Baal Shem, and which for him is something that can be used in a kind of a critical appraisal of the Western non-dialogic, monological ways that are based on I-it relations that sort of cut reality into pieces, but also instrumentalize the world, make the subject like a kind of a unique narcissistic principle of everything, and unable basically to relate to anything else apart from himself. So in a way, what Buber tries to do, although already in I Am Thou he's not so monistic, he's trying to come to this new understanding of reality as simultaneously one and multiple, right? It is a kind of a eternal paradox for him, and he will always claim that it is best expressed in Daoism. So he's no longer so monistic in his sort of understanding of the Oriental principle, but he actually accuses the West of being very monistic. That is basically he says the West is subjectivity and nothing else. Right? So if anything, actually Buber would say that the Western spirit is very acosmic, right? Because and that is exactly what he would say against Hegel. That after all, Hegel, praising all this differentiation, being so declaratively pro-cosmic for the world, right? The idea of the incarnation, of reconciliation, of transcendence, immanence, and so on. In the end, he does not really overcome the principle of subjectivity, Kantian subjectivity, from which the whole German idealism derives. So Buber basically says, no, it is actually the Oriental wisdom that can depart from monism into this kind of a dialogical, relational type of metaphysics of multiplicity, whereas the West is actually monistic and stuck in its idealist arche, which is the subject.
Thank you for a very enriching talk. So I'm interested in the fourth point of Buber's view about Taoism. It's about these, maybe not reconciliation, but harmony between yin and yang, which you use the term dream, amor fati, and non-action put together to sort of relate to the yin-yang philosophy, which I find very interesting, because what kind of dream are you talking about? We all know, well, some of us know that Zhuangzi dreams himself to be a butterfly and wonders if this life is the real life or the butterfly is his true identity. But then definitely Taoism or the Taoists wouldn't go so far as to assert, as the Buddhists would, that this life is an illusion. And so what kind of dream is that? So that would be the first layer of the question. And second is amor fati. That is such a Nietzschean trope for me, well, as a sort of quasi-Nietzschean scholar. And so how is that coming to Buber's interpretation? Because does it have anything to do with, this temporality, the unity of the past and present and the future? Does this have to do with some sort of notion of eternity? at all in Buber's interpretation?
Well, this is not exactly Buber. This is Hegel's
this is
reconstruction of what he calls Oriental metaphysics, which he towards the end accuses of being a cosmic ontological nihilism. Right. So basically, treating the whole phenomenal reality as nothing. Right. Nothing comes out of nothing and goes back to nothing. It's this famous sentence, right, that sums up the Oriental metaphysics according to Hegel. And why? Because indeed this is a kind of a dreamlike existence. And this is why I use Blake, because actually this is the same kind of imagination. The idea of awakening is the same in a kind of a Gnostic dualism, in Hegel dialectics, and in Blake's mysticism. The idea of awakening is associated with awakening to contraries, that is, of mobilizing the opposites to basically a struggle, to a fight. Right? To a fight which then has to, go through a history. This is why it could be a version of messianism, right? Because messianism involves this kind of a struggle of the opposites between the good and evil, and in which eventually good prevails. That is, wins over evil. So one side wins over the other. But that is what Hegel, Blake, would associate with awakening, right? Awakening. Whereas where the opposites do not awake to the struggle with the messianic finale, then they are asleep. Right? In this kind of a dreamy unity of intermingling of basically forming a kind of a chaotic whole, which Hegel compares the movement of the sea, right? Back and forth, a kind of an elemental force that moves, but does not have a kind of a purposeful dynamic. Okay? So this is why he says it is the opposite of awakening, right, to the struggling contraries. Hence, it is this, as Buber translates it, profound reverie. And now the term amor fati, he also uses, because it's not Nietzschean originally, it's Stoic, right? So it's this kind of a Stoic fatalism that in the kind of a dreamlike existence, nothing awakens to a state of struggle. So obviously you do not awaken to the state of struggle either, right? You just passively go with the flow. You adjust to the movement of this primordial fog. There's this primordial fog. Okay?
We'll have one final question, perhaps.
Thank you very much for your paper. I'm wondering at this time, how is Buber thinking about the resurrection of the dead as formulated by Maimonides and 13 Principles? Because with that story, the Death's Head, there seems to be almost a restaging or an inversion of Ezekiel and prophesying to the bones, and this time the bones sort of prophesy back and say, "Oh, wonderful, okay."
Okay, so this is the part where I noticed, because I realized that my presentation is a bit too long. so I omitted the part in which I make a comparison between the royal happiness of the Dao skull and the attitude of the martyrs, who actually ask Baal Shem and obviously God too, not to return to earth, and basically stay in the divine pleroma. First of all, without the obligation to reincarnate, because in Lurianic Kabbalah we have a version of metempsychosis, that is the wandering of the souls. So they don't want to be reincarnated, and they also do not want to be resurrected. But that also shows, and this is something that Buber really wants to gloss over, the very deeply Gnostic nature of the Hasidic tales, where, this kind of a return to nothingness is seen as superior to persevere in being.
Okay, we're super out of time, so thank you once again. Thank you all for your questions. Maybe like